occupied by young people who made a youth center, culture center there, and established also a rock radio station. And I will come to that later because there's a very interesting later history with this rock radio station by United Nations. And my foundation was established in '85 with the mission to end homelessness of single homeless people. The name of the foundation comes from a Finnish word yksinäinen, which means single or lonely person. And the new thing that we were doing, my foundation at that time, was we started to buy flats from the private market. And then we leased them to municipalities and NGOs to be used as rental flats for homeless people. So that was a way to extending the supply of affordable social housing. And this is something we have been doing since then. This picture shows the trend of homelessness in Finland since the 80s. So you can see that there has been a decrease in homelessness during this time. Well, this doesn't show what I was planning to show, but in the 1980s we had around 18,000 homeless persons in Finland, and now we have around 6,600 to almost 6,000. So this is still one important part of reducing homelessness in Finland, buying more housing stock from the private market and also providing housing from social housing, etc. But the real change actually happened in Finland in 2008. Before that, we had some evaluations where I was involved, where we looked at what we have achieved with the previous programs that we had national programs in Finland to end homelessness. And it showed that there had been a great progress, but still there was a group of homeless people who seemed to be left always out of the projects. Always we get new housing for homeless people, but still there seemed multiple social and health group of long-term homeless people who have most intensive care needs. And for that reason, our government decided to start a national program in 2008 with the idea that we should halve long-term homelessness by 2011 and end it by 2015. And there were two key elements in the program. The other one was the conversion of existing shelters and hostels into supported housing units, and also taking housing first approach as a mainstream principle in the Finnish policy to deal with homelessness. And this is an interesting and important thing to say, that we have been calling it housing first, but we came to the conclusions on our own thinking, starting from the experiences that we have had in Finland. And when we had written the program, we went to Google and realized that housing first already existed. There are a lot of common elements with the American model, but we are not implementing it, so it's not reasonable to compare what we have been doing with the US model. I could say that there are more similarities than differences, but also the differences may be important if you think about how you deal with homelessness in different contexts. I will come to that later. We are very pragmatic in Finland, so when we started this program, the first thing we thought about was how big is the problem, how much do we need flats for this group of long-term homeless people. And so we had a clear quantitative targets in the program, 2,500 new apartments, either supported housing units or care places in the 10 major cities, because homelessness in Finland is very much concentrated in these big cities, Helsinki metropolitan area, and also some other big cities. It seems that your computer is doing something with my slides, so I hope you can still see something. It's changing the slides. So what we have been doing, this is for the 80 years, starting from 2008 to 2016. The program period was for 8 years. So over 3,500 new apartments has been built or bought for homeless people. And at the same time, we have got over 300 new professional support workers in social work for homelessness. And also what we call housing advice services, which is the central element of prevention, homelessness prevention in Finland. They have been upscaled nationwide. Housing advisory services means that we have social workers who work in social housing companies or residential areas, and they help tenants when they end up in problems, for example, with rental areas, fixing payment plans or that kind of things, so that we could avoid unnecessary evictions. And Housing First principle, which is with very small letters here, has been established as a national policy. Actually, we don't speak so much about Housing First anymore because we think that there's not anything else in our system, so there's no need to discuss is this Housing First, because that's what we expect by default, that it is Housing First what we are doing. And maybe the most important element in the structure or the system of homelessness services is that shelters and hostels have been mainly replaced by supported housing units, and that needs a little bit explanation. First, still in very small letters, we had a program. Before the program, we had a group of 4 wise men four wise. I was a secretary in that group, and we made the principles of this future policy, and expressed in this way that solving social and health problems is not a prerequisite for arranging housing. You don't have to be housing ready, but instead housing is a prerequisite for that will also enable solving homeless persons' other problems. So you will get housing, permanent housing, unconditionally, and then it's a foundation for your living and solving the other issues. This one in the picture is one of the supported housing units we have for especially designed for homeless young people. Still in small letters. So housing first in Finland, the basic principles that we have, it means that housing is a basic human and social right, and housing should be in normal surroundings, and they should be permanent homes. So it means that you have your own rental contract with your in an independent rental apartment. But this apartment can be either in scattered housing or in a supported housing unit. An adequate support, if needed and wanted, is arranged, so you are not obliged to take the support, but there is a possibility to have support. And also it's unconditional. For that reason, the rental contract should be permanent, because the temporary rental contract is already a condition. It's not anymore unconditional if you have a permanent temporary rental contract. The principle of normality is very important for us, understood in the sense that what's common or what's customary or typical in the society. So it means, for example, that when a homeless person gets a rental apartment, he is a legal subject who has the same rights and same obligations as everybody else who has a rental contract. So he's expected to pay the rent also himself. Not so that there's an organization who provides the housing that pays part of the rent. So if he doesn't have any income, then he can apply for the general housing benefit as everybody else who is in the same situation, and also for supplementary social welfare benefit. And also another important element concerns the support. I really don't understand why it made so small. When I left home, they were looking very normal. It's your computer. That's the reason. So it also concerns the support that's provided, because in the US model they have a very intensive support. There's a multi-professional team, normally of 10 professionals working around a homeless person. But we think that in the Finnish welfare system, there's no need to build that kind of mini welfare regime around a homeless person. You don't need to provide that amount of special services if you have reliable social and health basic services, which the homeless person who has got a flat of his own can use as everybody else. Also the principle of normality apply here. So the Finnish model of support could be called maybe intensive case management, which means that a homeless person, if he needs support, he has a contact person, and if there's a need for a more extensive support, that's provided by this contact person or support worker. We have some idea what should be the level of support, but I think that in scattered housing or in these supported housing units, but I think that the main thing is that the support has to be flexible, so it has to react to the needs of the former homeless person to be effective. We have made an English book about this Finnish story or this Finnish policy, the home of your own. If you go to the website of Y Foundation, you will find it there to be downloaded for free, and I think that this book contains a lot of very practical information about the elements of this Finnish system of homeless services. Now we got even bigger letters. So, well, maybe it's to point out that this is important. So I will show you a couple of examples of what this supported housing means, and this Väinölä unit in Espoo is a good example. It's the total size of the building is I think optimal. We have 33 apartments, 35 tenants. It means there are 2 couples. It was built by Y Foundation, and we have leased it to the city of Espoo, which makes rental contracts with the tenants. They select the local homeless people who are in most urgent need. And support is provided by Salvation Army. The city of Espoo and Salvation Army have a contract about the support. So there are 11 co-workers working in this building. But everybody has an independent rental apartment with their own contract, and you can take part in the common activities arranged in the facilities. They have, for example, a low threshold work activities for their tenants, a lot of other things. But you are not obliged. You can live on your own in your own apartment, do whatever you want, if that's your choice. And also, these tenants here, they do a lot of you could call community work or environmental work, because they go around in the neighborhood, for example, picking trash, and they are very well liked by the neighborhood tenants because they are part of the community and they are doing their own part for the common good. Well, back to small letters. This is this was the last big shelter we had in Helsinki, run by Salvation Army, a very old one. It was originally established opened in the 30s. And as a shelter, it had 250 bed places, which means that there were rooms where there were some rooms were for one man, some for two, but there were rooms where there were 4 people sleeping in the same room as a shelter. And 2012, it was renovated into supported housing, completely renovated, so that they now have 81 independent rental apartments in the building. And on-site personnel also here provided by the Salvation Army with the same philosophy. And this is a very good example of the effects of this national program, because the way the Salvation Army nowadays works in Finland is completely different than it used to be. So they are one of the most progressive NGOs or organizations arranging very varied services for homeless people, and a lot of employment activities also, which is, I think, one of the key elements when you try to build ways for social integration, to provide employment opportunities for former homeless people. So this picture, maybe this table shows the change that has happened since the 80s. At that time we had in hostels and shelters over 2,000 bed places. And still in 2008 we had almost 600. And during this program the number has gone down. It has been replaced by the supported housing unit and scattered housing. So one service center for homeless people, which is kind of emergency place where you can go if you don't have any other place where to go, and they have 52 bed places there. But you can also see the amount of social housing apartments. There has been a huge increase since the 80s to 2008. The social housing is mainly built by municipal housing companies in Finland, and it has played an important role in providing housing for people in the risk to become homeless or people who have already become homeless. And still it's an important element of the Finnish system. This is the conclusions that I have reached after 10 years of learning. You can't have housing first without having housing first. In many European countries where I have been, there are very eager people to implement housing first, and then they say to me that yes, we could really go on now, but we lack the housing because there isn't that kind of social housing. It's mainly the lack of affordable social housing which is the reason that there's not housing available even for housing first projects. Now it's okay. I have to check that it moved in the right direction. Social housing plays an important role in Finland as an element of prevention of homelessness and also as a route out of homelessness. And this is an example that we have in Helsinki. It is a very special social housing because it's done together with an Elmo Foundation, which is a foundation of musicians. And actually, it's the foundation of the guys who had the radio station I told you earlier about. It was run in the cell after the shelter was closed. And when the building finally was demolished, they sold the radio station and they got the money to build a foundation. A few years ago, they approached us and said that could we help with them to build a social housing unit for low-income musicians, because not everybody is a big rock star. Most musicians are very low incomes. So part of the flats are reserved for low income musicians. 74 apartments and 25 are reserved for musicians. And there are also a couple of training facilities in the building. So we are very lucky because now we have a house band of our own. Your machine is thinking now. Some facts about the social housing in Finland has to be explained because it really plays so important role. At the moment we have around 13% of the total housing stock affordable social housing. And in Finland it means that the rent level is significant and it's meant for people with low incomes and urgent housing needs. But there's no absolute income. When you are living in a social housing flat and you get better job and more income, you are not obliged to move on. So you can stay there as long as you pay your rent. But even more important is the fact that in new housing areas in the big cities, there's always 20% of the housing stock is affordable social housing. For example, last year, over 8,500 new units started. They are mainly built by city housing companies or NGOs, non-profit NGOs like Vive Foundation. It's based on a financing system where you get state-guaranteed loans for 40 years. And state gives subsidies if the interest rate is at the moment over 2.5%, which is not the case. So at the moment, the state doesn't pay any money for the system, but still they get that amount of affordable social housing. So this is a very, very cheap system for the state. So there are normal bank loans that we get for the housing. One element which makes it possible to have affordable rent is also that they are built on public land owned by the municipalities. For example, the city of Helsinki owns over half of the total area of Helsinki. So the politicians have a very big role in deciding what kind of housing is going to be built in Helsinki. And also, maybe one important element is to say that it has a very good quality, this social housing in Finland. When you go new housing area, by looking at the buildings, you can't make the difference. You can't say which one is social housing and which one is private rental apartments or owner-occupied housing. I think I'm not the only one, but I know that there are different opinions. But in my view, social housing it's a necessary social infrastructure. It's not a playground for financial speculation. It's a social right that should be provided for people with low incomes. It's a very much also a question about social fairness that you can provide that kind of housing in cities. We continue in the small mode. What have we achieved? Homelessness has decreased in Finland. In recent years, we have been the only European Union country because Norway also has, the homelessness has always also gone down in Norway, but I jokingly said that we don't count Norway because they have the oil money, they can do whatever they want, which is actually really true. Yeah. So, but the trend has been going down. Last year we had 6,615 single homeless persons and 214 families. And the families can also be couples, so it doesn't mean that there are children involved. 84% of these homeless people live temporarily with friends and relatives, so they are not roofless. We don't have actually street homelessness. when you go around in Helsinki, you don't find people sleeping on the streets. Only occasionally you will find, or you need expert help to find the few people who still sleep rough in Helsinki. And we don't have anymore as an element shelters and hostels in the system. And I think that this has been the very important element in changing the existing system. We have problems or things that we have to very much work in the future, and what concerns me is the level of women's homelessness, because the absolute numbers have not gone down since 2008, so we need to find specific services that women can use, and that's a project that we have started now with several NGOs and three cities also. And especially the big change has been the decrease in long-term homelessness, which has gone down with 1,500, almost 600, and they are really the people who have been in the most urgent or most or need of most intensive support. Now this is going to be more interesting. Well, I can read to you what I have been writing there, because it seems to lack a lot of material. These are about the housing, about the costs of the program. There were several financial sources for the program, but the basic idea was that the state and the municipalities would pay each half of the total cost, 50-50. That was a fair deal, or at least everybody thought so. So there was money for housing from ARA, which is the Housing and Finance Development Center in Finland. It's a state-owned fund, but it's outside the state budget, so they have more flexibility to give money than if the money would be within the state budget. So it was, during this 8 years, it was around 84 million grants for building. You could get investment grants for the supported housing units that were meant for long-term homeless people, 50%. And then we got money from the National Lottery, almost the same amount to buy flats from the private market. So there's quite a big amount of scattered housing. This supported housing, which I have been describing here, is only a small part of the total amount of housing stock available for homeless people. And then cities and NGOs, of course, they needed to loan money from the banks for the building and for buying the flats. So you could say that the total cost of the program were around 400 million euros during this time in the 8 years. And with that money we got housing for 3,500 homeless people. But it's interesting that the most important money that was given to municipalities was 20 million grants from the Ministry of Social Affairs and Health Development for salary cost of support workers. This was the real incentive for the cities to be involved, because for the program period they could get half of the cost of the salary cost of these new support workers from the state. But in a sense I would say that this really is not a money issue, because in 2008 the worst economic recession since Second World War hit Finland, so there was really a lack of money, but still this kind of thing could be done with homelessness. All the cities that were involved, even though they may have had some problems during the years, they kept their promises about finding the housing for homeless people. There's another element of the costs, because this kind of thing also brings savings for the society. We had evaluation by the Technical University of Tampere, which estimated that we get savings for 15,000 euros per one person per 1 year when a homeless person gets permanent housing in supported housing unit, all costs included. And they compared the cost of service use when a person was homeless, counted all costs, social welfare, institutional care, health care, special health care, police, justice system, whatever they could get, all information, and compared to the costs when they were rehoused permanently. So you can say that housing a homeless person with support, it's an investment that pays itself back. I have said here that in maximum 7 years, but it can be even earlier. And the cost savings, of course, are bigger during the years in the long run when a homeless person may need less support or returns to employment. So this is also reasonable thing to do, or economically viable to really try to solve homelessness. So what next, or what's happening right now? We have now a national program for homelessness prevention, and I think that this prevention is the element that we really have a lot of more work to do. I thought about housing advisors. We have now 80 housing advisors around the country, and last year, according to statistics, they say that they avoided almost 3,000 evictions. So you can imagine, of course, not always all people who are evicted end up becoming homeless, but still this is one of the main routes to homelessness, to be evicted from, also from social housing, not only from private housing, but also from social housing. And I thought that we have some problems with providing services for homeless women, and we have started this program now to develop these services. And also we have actually we have visited Manchester, where they have a very interesting project for homeless women. So we try to learn also from other partners. And now our government has made a decision of principle that they would like to, or they are willing, or they are determined, whatever word you want to use, to halve the existing homelessness before 2022, which means that we have to target efforts on people living temporarily with friends and relatives. And that's going to be quite difficult, because we know that we don't know enough of these people. So we know that they are living mostly in very precarious situations, but the actual needs, when it's only a question about providing housing, taking care of the debts they may have, it can be an obstacle to get the housing, or if there are more intensive support needs. That's something that we have to do research on. So it means that we need to have several thousand new apartments again for this group, which hopefully will eventually end in ending. And an essential element we are proposing now for our government, that in new housing areas, the share of affordable social housing should be raised from 20 to 30%. The rent level in affordable social housing, in average, it is 4 to 6 euros lower than the market rents. It's an average figure, but in small apartments, it can be up to 9 euros. So it's a very big difference in the actual rent that people are paying. So I think I'm going over my time, but I think that to conclude, I think what's needed to end homelessness, I think that it's obvious that you need a lot of political will, and in my understanding it means political will that's very much action-oriented, not media-inflated, because you have politicians who speak other things and do other things, or do not do what they say in public. But you need also to have very ambitious plans, and I think that the only thing when you work with homelessness is to aim to end homelessness, whatever goals you could have. That's the only ethically justified goal for homelessness policy and homelessness homelessness programs. Housing first is really the key element. It's really this century's answer to homelessness, but combined with affordable social housing. Without that, it's not going to work. And overall, I would say that we need less talk and more doing, and doing things together, because that has been the real strength of the Finnish policy, that the state, local authorities and NGOs have been able to work together towards the same goal. I have said earlier, this probably is not true in Scotland, but in England it's at least true, or my understanding of the situation, that in UK you may have a very civilized way of not working together. So you're very polite to other organizations, but when it comes to the real doing, so there's something more that could be done. Because I think, now I have to quote a couple of British authors. Geoff Malgan has said that it's not enough to have great ideas and host glorious arguments. Life depends on action. And I think that I would end with another quote from George Orwell, because he said it better than anybody else. Either we all live in a decent world or no one does. Thank you.
Well, that was absolutely wonderful, I thought. Now, just taking on that motif there about doing, I think we'll move to our next guest tonight. Kate Paulson is the Chief Executive of the Rock Trust, an organisation that does, and it delivers on a daily basis for young people experiencing homelessness here in Scotland. Now, one thing I would say is Kate's going to kind of give a bit of a Scottish perspective, which will be fantastic. But what I would say about Kate is that Kate's one of the most charismatic, I think, and one of the most incredible third sector leaders that we have in Scotland at the moment. Her knowledge around homelessness has been formed by direct experience, and I think that's why she's making the difference on the ground that we all love to see. So, without any more, Kate, please.
And it's totally my fault that you couldn't read that presentation. Sorry, I thought it was been helpful giving a computer for it, but clearly the computer turned everything really small. Thank you for inviting me along to speak tonight. It's great. I have worked with Ewan's team for a while now on the Housing First Europe Hub, and we've been trying to work together to encourage people across Europe and beyond, actually, to learn from each other, to share practice, and to start their own Housing First movements. But I think what we've realised in that time, and we have debates about it across all the different countries, is that each Housing First system, approach and programme is different, because we all work in different contexts. So when we get together in Europe and we work with lots of different countries, and they come and they say, our government's given us a big budget, but we've got no houses, or we've been given directives to do it, but there's no budget, or our population are housed in illegal housing because the mafia owns it, or there are reasons across the world that people are saying housing first. There's obstacles to housing first. And in reality for us, in Scotland, we've been doing housing first for a long time. We've not always called it that. We've not always followed every single principle. But there are organisations across Scotland working at both local and national levels that have been offering people who are unable to fit into any housing option here, have been offering people a house with all the support required to live in it. We've just not done it for the whole population. But what's more is I've been doing this kind of work for 20-something years now. And right at the beginning, we had people from across Europe visiting Scotland to learn from us. We have had world-leading legislation. And it was recognised across the world that we had amazing legislation. And what really happened in Scotland is that we had great policy and legislation, and we had implementation deficit disorder. So we had this great idea of how this was all going to work, how our system for housing and housing as a human right was going to work, but we didn't really make it happen on the ground fully. And actually what we did, with not having enough housing to house people, we created temporary systems to help us to manage that and help us to manage the process of someone becoming homeless, being housed in emergency housing and then moving on. And what really happened was not building the longer term housing, was our temporary housing structures expanded. So in the city we are sitting in tonight, we now have over 600 people spending tonight in a B&B because we don't have houses. So we essentially have a bed blocking system in our temporary accommodation. In other cities in Scotland, you have temporary flats. So people who are housed in temporary flats, much better option than a B&B. However, when a flat's still temporary, when you've been living in it for 3 years, there's something not quite right with the system. So actually for us, Housing First in Scotland is not just about a human right to housing, because we've always had that. We've had that in our legislation. But what we're talking about is not asking people to jump through the hoops of the B&B, the hostel, the temporary housing flat, and then eventually into their own tenancy, and only when they can prove themselves ready at each stage. Not only is it difficult because you get settled in a community and learn your skills in one type of housing, and your reward for that is getting chucked out and passed on to the next model of housing. And that happens at so many stages. We give people the place to fail. Actually, if we can put all of that support and all of that resource into placing someone into their house that will be their forever home, or has the potential to be their forever home, then actually we skip all of the trauma caused by the multiple placements, all of the trauma caused by being unable to work or socialise because you can't have guests in your hostel, or because you have a curfew in your B&B, and everything that happens with that. So actually in Scotland, we're not looking at quite as clear, I guess, a system as they have done in Finland. In Finland, they came up with a very clear strategy and applied it to all of their systems. In Scotland, our systems are very messy. They differ from authority to authority. And actually, before we started talking about Housing First in a formal way, based on evidence, we had already created these temporary accommodation systems, these emergency accommodation systems. We had got rid already of some of the big, huge institutional hostels, so the kind of 70-plus bed hostels or working man lodging houses that we used to have. We'd already got rid of quite a lot of those. We use shelters, but not as much as we used to, and more now for winter than all year round. So we were already moving to an improving position. So actually, for Housing First, for us, is not just a model of working, but it's an approach to how we house people. And right now, the Scottish Government is backing that. The Scottish Government are saying that rapid rehousing is the way forward. And when we're talking about rapidly rehousing people, Housing First is one of the rapid rehousing models. And what we've seen in Scotland so far is pilots of Housing First as a programme. So as a limited number of bed spaces with a limited budget, with one organisation providing it. But what we're now looking to do is get a plan in every local authority for how they will move to a position where they rapidly rehouse people, and where we can get those B&B numbers down and get the people living in temp flats down and move people from a position of insecure accommodation to more permanent solutions. And first off, we'll start with the traditional Housing First model, which is working with entrenched rough sleepers with multiple needs who will not access hostels or B&Bs. So starting at that point, can we house those people? And then can we move all of our models to a more permanent, secure, safe, stable, appropriate housing model? And that will include young people too. That was a whirlwind tour of Housing First in Scotland, and I'm very aware that we're all applying it differently across the country, but we are also all working together. So the consortiums that are gathering at the moment of organisations across Scotland, that we're all going to work together, learn from each other, and share that information. And that is the projects that are starting now. But the approach will take a bit longer to plan and make sure we've got clear plans for each local authority and for the whole country. Thank you very much.
Lovely. Thanks very much, Kate. Now, what we're going to do, we're going to re-rig round here very, very, very quickly, and then we'd like to listen to what you've got to say, okay? So what we're going to do, if you can just bear with us when we start to get the roving mic round, if you've got questions that you'd like to ask, if you've got a point that you wish to make, that's absolutely fine. We want to hear from you. But if you could wait for the mic to hit you, that would be good. It means that everybody gets to hear, and it means the folks that get at home get to hear it as well. Okay, then. Okay, thank you. Welcome back. Hope you've had a nice time with us already. Two great presentations that I think we've had today. One very much firmly based upon the Finnish experience, and what we heard from there from Kate is probably what I should have done earlier. And Kate fantastically filled you in on what's really going on in Scotland and maybe what's going to go on in the future. So, just if I could get a show of hands about anybody would like to ask a question. Sure, there's somebody. I mean, shall I just... That's one there, that's wonderful. If you could identify yourself, that would be absolutely fantastic.
Hi, I'm Jenny Davidson. I've got a couple of questions, actually, about the Finnish model. One is, if people who are homeless are being put into permanent housing with long-term contracts, how do you define who's homeless and when they've stopped being homeless? And the second question is, if I understood correctly, people with these contracts, they're responsible for paying the rent in the normal way, so presumably a proportion fail to manage that. And I just wondered kind of what the failure rate is, and then what happens to those who don't manage to kind of pay their rent and manage in long-term accommodation.
Okay, so just get to sum up there. So there's the second question on tenancy sustainability.
Yes, very, very good questions. And we define homeless people. The statistics are based on counts that we do both from the social welfare office and in housing departments. So there are people who have made an application to get housing from the housing department of the city, or either they have people who are clients of the social welfare office, which is a place for homeless people. In, for example, in Helsinki, they have one office that they can go. So the statistics are, you put this together and make sure that the same person is not twice. That's basically the idea how they collect the information. But there are, of course, faults in the system. It's not, but it gives the trend. It gives the feeling that how much homeless people we have. And homeless people is not anymore homeless when he has a rental contract of his own. The sustainability rate has been around 80%, which is approximately the same as it is in many other housing first projects. So basically the idea is that you can really get the general housing benefit and then also the supplementary social welfare benefit. So that's not the reason to not pay your rent, because it can be arranged. But there, of course, there has been some very, you could say also very funny incidents, because, for example, in Tampere they had one supported housing unit where the tenants were mostly elderly men who most of them already had pensions. And when they moved there, they got permanent rental contracts. It happened several times that when they had a pension day, which was also the day they were supposed to pay the rent, they didn't use banks, they gave the money in cash. They suddenly disappeared. So for a few days, nobody of the personnel knew where they were. And then they returned back and they got reprimanded that you have not paid the rent. And they said that well, this is housing first, you can't kick us out. But after a while, they learned that they really could get kicked out because they have the same responsibilities as everybody else. So it means that you will end up in maybe some more intensive support or living with friends and relatives, which is still the main place for homeless people in Finland.
Okay, Kate, would you like to give us a bit on that as well?
I think the reality is that, like in any type of housing, there will be people who sometimes don't pay the rent, and that's the reality. And I think what we need to remember is that Housing First, we talk about it as being non-conditional, but we also talk about it as being normal. So actually, the tenancy agreement you have is a normal tenancy agreement where rent payment is expected and antisocial behaviour is not tolerated, and your landlord still has absolutely the same responsibility to your neighbours that they would have in any other setting. But the difference here is that there's also a really intensive support package. So if the person is on payday disappearing and avoiding their landlord, the support worker will be tracking them down to the point of stalking. And that's part of the Housing First intensive support, is that the Housing First support worker will do whatever it takes to help that person maintain that accommodation. And if that means turning up at the post office or the bank on payday to have a discussion about whether or not they should remove all their money and spend it, then that will happen. So I think actually it's a much more supportive housing process than any of the other supported accommodation placements that we have.
Okay.
I think that the attitude now with this Housing First is completely different, so that the personal homeless support workers, they really try to keep the tenants within the housing, because they understand what's the reason. When we started this program, the Helsinki Diakonis Institute has been one of the pioneers in Finland, and Heli Alkila, who is the director, told me that she was telling her staff that now we are in the future working in a different way with this Housing First system. And one of the staff who had been used to the old way of working said that, well, it means that we are not getting rid of our tenants. And Heli told her staff that this is exactly the idea of the new system. We are not getting rid of our clients. So everything has to be done to make it possible.
So I think two things there. One, about the normality of the Housing First approach in terms of it's a normal contract, basically. Also, some very interesting, I thought there as well, talking about homelessness statistics. It is a minefield. One thing I can say as a member of the Scottish Government's Homelessness Prevention Strategy Group is an awful lot of work is going ahead now on ensuring that statistics that we have on homelessness are a lot more effective than they are at the moment. Let's take another question. Wonderful. Gentleman at the back. If you can just tell us who you are, that'd be smashing.
Thank you. I'm Doug Gibson. Thank you both for the presentations. Inspiring to hear what's been done and what's happening now. I had a question for Juha about the Finnish model and the funding specifically. So you spoke about the savings to the public purse of a person in a Housing First tenancy because there's less of demand on police and criminal justice and mental health and addiction services, so it's right spread across. When it came to the funding of the model itself, did those areas contribute? Or was it just a case of seeing the savings? Did that question make sense?
Well, after I have answered, you can say if that made
Sure.
sense. So basically, the savings come from different sources, and in the point of view of in Finland, the cities, municipalities have the main responsibility for arranging the services. So the savings mostly come to the city also, but they are not counted in the way that there would be one account that the savings come to the same account where you pay the money for providing the services. But still, if you look at the whole budget of the city, you can see that we have got savings from here, and we have got more costs because of this system here. So
in Finland, they essentially see their whole city budget as one thing. So
Okay,
the savings
okay.
in one part of the budget are great if they're made by another.
That sounds
We've
great.
not quite got that down here. So at the moment, we know that Housing First costs the housing department quite a lot of money to put in place, and the savings will be, I mean, eventually they will be in housing, but the savings, it's a big investment at the start, and the savings will come out across health and justice and and everywhere else, communities. But actually, those are different budgets.
Just to give
in
you
Finland, they see it as city savings, city investment, city. Yeah.
To give you a little bit of background on that, and I would advise the Scottish Government this year published a really interesting paper in July, which looked at the savings in the health service towards taking a better approach towards homelessness. Now, that wasn't, as you were suggesting, sir, about the criminal justice system, the policing system. But if we look at A&E on its own, every time there is an unplanned visit to A&E, it costs 126 quid. You know, and what we do know is that homeless people tend to pitch up at A&E a lot more often. I think what was interesting about the Finnish system, what was very clear there, is what you were saying is that going down the housing first approach, you had a payback period of 7 years or less. We'd certainly believe that that would be the case in Scotland as well. The problem is that the big winners will be the health service and the criminal justice system. Whether they're going to top slice their budgets, well, that remains to be seen. But a brilliant question, and one is I certainly know that makes us all scratch our heads from time to time. Let's see if we can get another question, please. The lady just down here.
Hello, I'm Annie Rhodes. You talked about the Scottish Government showing some inclination towards having the will to work with a scheme, Housing First. What about, where does that sit with the availability of actually land to build houses, or the right to convert some buildings into houses and not yet more hotels? I'm thinking of Edinburgh particularly, but it will be true in other cities that are now popular on the tourist routes. And student housing too, you know, another area of need. Have one other question too about universal income. And I know that Finland has trialled that, but I think that is going to end. I wondered if you had comments about the link between that and homelessness, whether you thought it was a good idea or it didn't really have much bearing because benefits are paid anyway. I don't know.
Okay, should we take the UBI point of your question first, if that's okay,
Yes,
and then we'll move on with Kate to maybe talk about housing availability and land values.
Well, I think that it's a pity that they are ending the experiment because it was very limited time and a very limited amount of people involved in that. So you can't really make conclusions based on that experiment. But it did have very little relevance to homelessness. So, yeah.
Kate, have some water and land values.
Yeah. In terms of housing availability, it's actually different in every local authority. So there are some local authorities that do have housing that is sitting empty. It's not always owned by the local authority, but I think we're trying a little bit of everything. So the Scottish Government has a programme of house building that is happening across Scotland. We are also looking to speak with people who own multiple properties to get them on board. We have now in our local authorities, we have empty homes officers that are working in each local authority, trying to get access to privately owned properties that are sitting empty and rotten. We have funders now that are working with many of our third sector partners, offering them the opportunity to renovate properties that will become affordable for example, young people so they can go back to work. So we have a variety of programmes to try and bring accommodation back into the country in some way and make it available for use and affordable for use. But whilst you has talked about the fact that a lot of countries talk about the lack of housing being the biggest barrier to housing first, I think there are countries that have bigger barriers that are doing more. So for me, I think that we can't say we can't do it because we've not built enough houses. We have to make it happen. We have housing available, we have buildings available that can be renovated, and we have housing which is sitting empty, which is shocking. So yeah, I think if we want to do it and if there's a will there, we'll make it happen.
Thank you very much indeed. Kate, let's go back to the floor again. Another question? The gentleman right there.
I'll just follow that up a little bit. You said that in Finland the proportion now is going up to 30% of affordable housing, social housing that's been built with every housing scheme. Does that mean that you've got considerable shortage still of social housing
Well, we are proposing that it should go up from 20 to 30%, and it's a problem. Housing situation is problematic in the Helsinki metropolitan area, not anywhere else. So there would be a need to have that amount of affordable social housing, because there's already a lack of people working in very many professions in service and in care that can't afford living in the metropolitan area. So that's the reason that it should be much bigger. If you look at the people's incomes and you look at the rent they have to pay, so it's very easy to make the conclusion that we should have more of that. But to be honest, I don't want to make a too rosy picture of Finland, because there are also people who have a different idea. People, especially some economists, who say that market will take care of everything. So let's stop this supported housing and only give housing benefit so that people can choose wherever they want to live. But it's always with economists. I don't want to discuss with them. It's not good for my blood pressure.
I think the forces of darkness stalk all over the world, unfortunately. Just to put this into a bit of Scottish perspective, the peak council housing building period year was 1971. It's gone downhill ever since 1971. And unfortunately, I think one of the points is about, it's not just about housing, it's affordable housing as well, is the crucial thing. And the problem is at the moment is if you've got a council rent in this country, it's going to be around about £330 a month. The average private sector rent in this country is 777, and in this city, it's nearer 1,000.
And I think we know the ways out of homelessness are affordable housing and employment. That's the best way to get out and stay out of homelessness. So we would always want to increase the amount of social and affordable housing. However, we have seen housing first projects in London, for example, using privately shared housing and using a room in a shared house for a housing first tenant. So actually, again, we shouldn't see it as a barrier to us implementing it. There's obviously an ideal of having social housing, affordable housing, new housing, and increasing the number, but we actually do have property that can be used in the country. So
I think that's what yes, we can, Kate.
Yes.
I think we'll have to call you. Can we take another question, please? Just beyond that lady there.
Hi, Phil Donnelly, Rooney. I'm interested in the support needs that you had described. You talked about 10 professionals per homeless person. I'm interested in what skills these professionals had and whether they came from NGOs or from statutory organisations, whatever. It's basically
in terms of support workers, what was their kind of skill level? Do they come from an NGO background, or do they come from a social work background, or is it a mixture? So, is that a fair summation?
In Finland, the support workers, they all have vocational training in there. So that's the basic requirement for people. There can be people working in NGOs or people working for municipalities. So they can be social workers, but there are also other titles that you have. It's I don't know how to translate it into English. The title of in Finland it's called, you could call it a basic nurse or something like that, which covers both social and health sector. Basic vocational training.
Health and social care equivalent. I guess what's important to say is housing first, as well as the principles of it being an unconditional property, as in you don't have to engage in support or get sober or whatever that looks like. One of the other things that all of the evidence from the projects across America and Europe, if you want to be clear with the model and stick to it, so if you want the same outcomes that they've got in the previous programmes, then you would have a caseload of between 5 and 7 per worker. So for each worker, there'd be 5 to 7 people they would work with, because it's quite intensive support levels. And to put that in perspective, in kind of normal homeless supported accommodation services, you would have caseloads of somewhere between 12 and 17 or something like that. So it's a much higher ratio of worker to people, and therefore much more expensive and intensive at the start. But the people you're working with will tend to have higher level of support need. Won't tend to kind of keep appointments. So whereas normal housing support services, you'll have to fulfill. So it's a bit more of intensive support, much more responsive, and a slightly higher skill level.
In the original US model, which was targeted to people living mental health institutions, there was a very high quality of professional skills. So there was also, for example, a psychiatrist.
Yeah, I think there's also a real. I don't really want is the medicalisation of this issue, and I think that that's something that other countries have gone down that road and not got the results that was needed. So that's the reason why. I think one of the issues is actually about one of the things I would say, and I'm not sure if Kate will welcome this, is some work that we're doing on the moment, which is on frontline burnout. And I think having huge caseloads is one of the real issues. Kate?
Yeah, I think the reality is that we've seen a downward trend in the funding available for homeless services, and at the same point we are becoming more regulated, so you have to have more qualification and regulation of your workers, and there's less. Because it is the only service and such a robust evidence base, it means that we can very clearly make a business case for having very low caseloads, because that's the way to get the outcomes. Now, there is research which shows that projects that had higher caseloads per worker didn't do as well. So we've got that, and we've never had that before, not in any of our other services. And we've got that in multiple. It's just extensions. And we've got that in across multiple countries as well, and in multiple projects. So actually, there are model people per worker.
What do we say? You can't get champagne services on ginger beer money, but that's another issue altogether. Gentleman just over there.